The winter of 1944 settled over Berlin like a punishment. Cold crept in through broken window panes, rolled down stairwells and sank into cellars where people tried, trembled, and failed to get warm. Outside, the city coughed smoke. Buildings with their faces torn open stared at the streets with black, empty windows. The air smelled of wet stone, coal dust, and something metallic that everyone pretended not to recognize. In the basement of a once elegant apartment building on the east side, an 11-year-old boy sat on an overturned crate, listening to the silence between the sounds. His name was Jakob Stein. The room around him had not been designed for living things. It was low-ceilinged, damp, with pipes running along the concrete like veins under pale skin. A single bare bulb swung slightly every time a truck passed above, sending shadows crawling over the walls like nervous hands. Jakob sat with his back against the rough brick, knees pulled to his chest, arms wrapped around them. His coat, 2 sizes too large, was buttoned all the way to his throat. The wool scratched, but he didn't move. His dark hair hung in a ragged fringe over his forehead, and his eyes, too large for his thin face, fixed on the narrow slit of light under the door. He watched it as if the world could be measured in the way that tiny strip of light changed. Heavy boots crossing the courtyard above made the light jump with each step. Distantly, someone shouted. A truck's engine snarled, coughed, then faded. Somewhere farther away, the wail of a siren rose, wavering, then was swallowed by the thick winter air. His mother sat in the corner, mending a sleeve by the light of a candle she cupped in her hand. The flame painted her face in flickering gold and shadow, erasing the lines of exhaustion and, for a heartbeat at a time, bringing back the woman she had been before the uniforms came. Before the posters. Before the city had rearranged itself around fear. On the crate beside Jakob lay a cracked photograph in a cheap metal frame. The glass had shattered weeks ago when a bomb had fallen somewhere close enough to make the walls shudder, but his mother had wrapped a strip of cloth around the edges so he wouldn't cut his fingers when he touched it. The photograph showed another Berlin. In it, the sky was spring bright, washed clean by recent rain. The streets were crowded with people who walked without looking over their shoulders. A boy, Jakob, though slightly younger and several kilos heavier, stood between his parents in a suit that was too stiff and a smile that was too wide. Behind them, a shop sign in carefully painted letters read, Stein and Sohn, Bücher und Papierwaren. Books and stationery. His father's pride. In the photo, the shop window was full of neat rows of notebooks, pens, Hebrew texts, and little carved wooden dreidels his father insisted on placing properly, for the children. On the glass, a small gold star glinted, not the one sewn later on coats and worn under compulsion, but a delicate star of David his father had stuck there himself. So they know who makes the best ink in all of Berlin, he joked, winking at Jakob. Now the actual star hid in the lining of Jakob's coat. His mother had picked the stitches back open in the dead of night, trembling hands working by touch more than sight. The yellow badge, once sewn proudly over his heart because there had been no choice, had been cut smaller, folded, and buried in the fabric like a secret. Sometimes Jakob felt its edges against his side when he breathed. It itched, but he didn't complain. It was the only thing left that said clearly, this is what you are. Upstairs, another door slammed. A man laughed, the sound sharp and ugly, cutting through the muffled quiet. His mother's needle paused in midair. Jakob didn't flinch. His gaze slid from the crack of light under the cellar door to the exposed pipes above it, counting them in his head. One thick pipe, two thinner, one with a constant, almost inaudible drip. He tracked the rhythm without thinking. Water hit the same rust spot every time. Drip, drip, drip. There had been a time when the sounds of Berlin were different. They came back to him sometimes, not as memories but as sensations. The way the bell over the shop door used to ring and his father would straighten up behind the counter, wiping his hands on his apron. The smell of new paper and binding glue. His mother humming as she arranged displays. The Friday evenings when his grandfather would come, his beard smelling faintly of tobacco and soap, and they would light candles in the small back room, closing the door softly on the busy street. The world had felt full then. Cluttered with noise and light but in a way that made sense. The first change had been the posters. One morning they sprang up like a rash across the city, shrill colors shouting from walls and lampposts. Red and black, white circles, twisted crosses. His father had come back from the market with his jaw clenched so tight it made a little crease by his ear that Jakob had never noticed before. "They're only posters," his mother had said, not quite convincingly. "They will come and go." They did not go. Then there were the laws. The notices. The lists of things they could no longer do. No more park. No more cinema. No more riding in certain tram cars. No more books from the library. No more business with good Germans who wanted to keep their windows intact. The gold star had appeared later, demanding to be worn on the outside of who they were. By then the city's sounds had already shifted. Laughter had become something that stopped abruptly when someone in a brown or black uniform walked past. Conversations broke off mid-sentence. People lowered their eyes. Later still, it wasn't just sounds that changed. It was smells. Smoke that wasn't from fireplaces. Exhaust from trucks that carried no goods, only people who did not come back to the neighborhood. And then one day his father had not come back either. He was taken for questioning. His mother had whispered, sitting on the edge of Jacob's bed that night, fingers twisted together in her lap. "He will come back. Your father always comes back." He had not. The drip from the pipe above dragged Jacob back into the cellar. Drip, drip. Somewhere, a clock he couldn't see ticked, the sound dull as if underwater. In the far corner, an old man with a gray beard sat on a stack of coal sacks, his coat collar turned up against the cold. His name was Reb Mendel. Jacob did not know if that was his full name or only what everyone called him. He had appeared in the basement 3 weeks ago, led down by Jacob's mother after a frantic whisper at the front door. Since then he had barely spoken. His eyes were the color of old paper, and they watched everything without seeming to move. Now he murmured something under his breath in Hebrew, the words falling softly like dust. "Is it a prayer?" Jacob asked, his voice low, not wanting it to echo. The old man's lips twitched. "It can be," he said quietly. "Or it can be a memory. Sometimes they sound the same." Jacob liked the way the man spoke. Slow, as if words were something to be weighed first. It was different from the sharp barks of orders they heard above, the clipped commands that made his mother's shoulders tighten. The building they hid in had been partly damaged by a bombing raid months before. The top floors were smashed open, exposed to the sky like a dollhouse torn in half. But the lower floors and the cellar remained intact. It made the place useful. Useful things in Berlin now were always owned by someone with a uniform. On the floor directly above the cellar, 3 rooms had been requisitioned by the Wehrmacht. Officers came and went. They slept there between shifts, their polished boots lined neatly by doors at night, their belts hung on chair backs. Sometimes the smell of their food drifted down through the cracks in the floorboards. Meat, coffee, tobacco. It made Jacob's stomach clench and growl, a traitor. Some nights he could hear them laughing. He'd learned to distinguish them by their footsteps. One walked with a limp so slight his mother hadn't believed him at first when he said he could hear it. Another always paused 1 second longer than the others outside the cellar door, as if considering whether to open it. As if aware but not enough, not yet. Jacob knew not to make noise. He knew to breathe shallow when Boots approached. He knew exactly how long it took his mother to blow out a candle and for darkness to swallow them whole. "You listen too much," his mother had said once, attempting a smile as she brushed his hair off his forehead. "A boy your age should think of other things." "What other things?" he had asked. Her mouth had opened, then closed again. "Stories," she'd said finally. "Games. You used to make up worlds with your father on the tram, remember?" He remembered. But back then, the tram had been something that moved them through a world that was, in itself, already a story. Now it was something he watched from a distance, carrying strangers whose fate no longer seemed connected to his. Now he listened. A soft knock at the cellar door made everyone in the room tense. The candle in his mother's hand wobbled. Wax spilled onto her fingers, but she didn't cry out. "Who is it?" she whispered. A voice answered from the other side, low and hurried, in German. "The landlord. The one who pretended he did not know that the cellar was occupied in a way that could get him shot." Jacob's mother crossed the room and opened the door only a crack. A draft of colder air rushed in, smelling faintly of tobacco and the faint chemical scent of wet concrete. The landlord's narrow face appeared in the gap, his hat pulled down low. "They are staying longer," he muttered, not bothering with greetings. His eyes flicked past her shoulder into the dim room, locating Jacob, the old man, the small bundle of belongings in the corner, the pallet of blankets on the floor. "Another officer arrived today. A Hauptmann. They've set up some sort of office upstairs." His mother's mouth tightened. "How long?" He shrugged, a quick, helpless movement. "Days. Weeks. Who knows? They come and go." His gaze shifted back to the boy. A flicker of something, pity, annoyance, passed over his features. "Make sure he doesn't make noise," he added. "I heard one of them asking about the cellar door already. They don't like closed doors." "We won't be a problem," she said quickly. "That's what you think," he muttered, but still he kept his voice low. "And keep him away from them." His eyes flicked again toward Jacob, then away as if the look made him uncomfortable. They're superstitious, these men, even under all that metal and leather. They don't like children who stare at them like that. Like what? Jacob's mother asked sharply. But the landlord was already pulling his hat down further. Just keep him quiet, he said, and pulled the door closed again. The latch clicked. Silence poured back into the room like water. Jacob's mother stayed by the door for a moment, her hand resting on the wood as if she could feel through it the vibrations of boots, voices, the heartbeat of the building above. Reb Mendel's eyes found Jacob's face. What does he mean like that? The old man asked softly. Jacob looked at his hands. They were thin, the knuckles standing out whitely. Little half-moons of dirt hid under his nails. I don't know, he said. It wasn't entirely true. He knew the way the officers looked back at him when, on rare occasions, he'd been forced to cross a corridor at the same time as they did. How their confident strides faltered for half a second. How their eyes snagged on his and then, almost violently, tore away. How they cleared their throats, adjusted their belts unnecessarily, suddenly more aware of their own bodies in the narrow space. Jacob never said anything in those moments. He simply watched. Feigning ignorance was one of the few protections a child had left in Berlin. Jacob. His mother's voice was soft but carried a warning. Don't stare at them. Ever. Do you understand? Keep your eyes down. He nodded. But when the next wave of footsteps crossed the floor above their heads, he tilted his head slightly, listening not just to the sound but to the spaces between the steps, to the weight of each footfall, to the tiny hesitations that lived there. Outside, far away, another siren began to rise, a thin wail threading its way through brick and mortar. Above, the men in uniforms moved through the rooms as if they owned the building. In the cellar, an 11-year-old boy listened, eyes wide open in the dim light, and the war pressed in on him from every direction. He did not know it yet, but the officers upstairs would soon begin to talk about him in low, uncomfortable tones, as if afraid the walls could hear. For now, Berlin simply held its breath. The next morning, if it could be called morning in a basement where time existed only through footsteps and changes of temperature, Jacob woke before anyone else. His eyes opened slowly, not because of sound but because of the end of silence. There was a difference. Silence in the cellar was a natural part of the night, but the silence before footsteps and voices was something else. Something taut, stretched like a string ready to snap. He lay still, listening. There it was, the soft vibration of boots on the boards above, someone pacing in short, agitated steps. Not the heavy, casual thuds of an officer preparing for duty, but a restless rhythm, as though the person was rehearsing a thought they could not speak. Jacob turned his head slightly toward the ceiling. 6 steps forward, pause, 5 back. 6 forward again, pause. Then a sudden, sharp crack as though a fist or object hit wood or glass. His mother stirred on the pallet beside him, her breath hitching as though waking from a dream she had been forced to run through. Is it morning? She whispered. Jacob shook his head slightly. Not yet. The old man, Reb Mendel, coughed 2 short, dry coughs, the same ones he always did when waking. Someone is troubled, he murmured, eyes still closed. Jacob's gaze stayed on the ceiling, his breathing perfectly calm, as if synchronizing with the rhythm of the steps above. The pacing continued for another minute, then stopped abruptly when another man, judging by the lower tone of voice, entered the room above. Muffled voices, tense, harsh, cut through the floorboards. Jacob could not hear the words, but he could hear what they were made of: anger, confusion, and something buried underneath: fear. Not fear of danger outside. Fear of something inside the same building. By midday, the officers began descending the staircase that led to the courtyard outside. Jacob listened to the cadence of their boots, counting subconsciously, for men, not 3 as usual. The 4th walked faster, breathing harder, his weight uneven. It was the new one, the Hauptmann the landlord had mentioned. The cellar door did not open, but Jacob felt a tension linger on it. Not curiosity. Suspicion. His mother pretended to ignore it as she prepared the little breakfast they had, a crust of hard bread softened with drops of water and shared equally. She handed Jacob his tiny piece with a soft touch, brushing his cheek for only a second. Eat slowly, she whispered. The mind thinks better when the body believes there is enough. Reb Mendel murmured from the shadows, hunger sharpens perception. Full stomachs make people blind. Jacob didn't know which man he agreed with, so he said nothing and ate quietly. The rest of the day was endured in silence, broken only by occasional thumps from above and the faint clatter of boots leaving and returning. The officers seemed louder, angrier, tense, like dogs who sensed a storm long before it arrived. That night, as candlelight flickered weakly and cast trembling shadows on the walls, something new happened. Someone tried the cellar door. The handle turned slowly, not with force but with testing curiosity. Jacob's mother froze, her breath held. Reb Mendel straightened, head slightly raised. The handle stopped after half a turn. A long pause. Then two knuckles tapped the wood. Not aggressively. Not politely. Almost cautiously. After a moment, steps retreated. No one spoke for several minutes, as though words could still be heard through the grain of the door. Finally, Reb Mendel whispered, "They sense something. Or someone." Jacob didn't answer. His eyes had fixed on the door, unblinking, pupils dilated, reflecting the candle flame like black glass. 2 days later, the encounter happened. Jacob and his mother had to ascend to the ground floor briefly. The landlord insisted on checking the drain that ran behind the cellar, a task that required them to wait in the corridor while he worked. He whispered urgently as he led them up the stairs. "Keep your eyes down. Do not speak. Do not draw attention." Jacob said nothing, but internally he wondered how people could believe attention was something one chose to draw. He had seen stray dogs that frightened people without barking, simply by looking too long at a person's hands as if seeing not skin but intentions. He remembered those dogs now. The hallway was colder than the cellar, cold in a proud, conscious way, not accidental. Its silence was not natural. It was a silence maintained like polished boots and pressed uniforms. The three of them stood close to the wall as officers passed through, heading out on rotation. The first two men didn't even look at them. The third officer, tall, handsome in a way polished like a statue, slowed mid-step as soon as Jacob's head raised the smallest fraction, not enough to be rudeness, just enough to see. The officer's eyes met Jacob's. And something shifted. There was no hostility, no threat, no recognition. Only discomfort, a discomfort that bloomed so quickly it startled even him. The man's stride faltered, his shoulders tensed, and he swallowed hard as if his throat suddenly felt too tight. Jacob did not blink. The officer attempted to look away, then stopped, forced himself to look back as though needing to prove something to himself. But the longer he looked, the more something inside him recoiled. His pupils tightened, his breath shortened, and his jaw twitched involuntarily. He stepped aside muttering, "Entschuldigen," though Jacob had not moved or blocked his path. The fourth man, the Hauptmann, had been watching silently from the other end of the corridor. He had a face that tried too hard to appear calm. His eyes darted between Jacob and the officer who had just passed. He walked forward slowly. Not marching. Studying. He stopped 3 steps from Jacob, looking down with a practiced authority meant to crush resistance. Jacob felt his mother's hand tighten painfully around his shoulder, silently begging, "Lower your eyes, please." But curiosity was stronger than obedience. He looked up, not challengingly, not fearfully, simply observing. They stood like that for 5 seconds. But 5 seconds felt like a diagnosis. Something flickered in the Hauptmann's expression, not fear exactly but unease mixed with calculation, like someone seeing an animal that wasn't dangerous, yet wasn't normal. "Wie heißt du?" the Hauptmann asked quietly. "What is your name?" Jacob didn't answer. His mother did. "He does not speak German well anymore, sir. He is frightened." The statement was partially true, partially shield. The Hauptmann's gaze stayed locked on Jacob even while responding to the mother. Children are rarely silent without purpose. Reb Mendel, who stood behind them, spoke softly, "Some children learn silence faster than language." The Hauptmann's eyes flicked very slightly at the voice, then returned to Jacob, not because it was polite, but because he could not help it. He stepped back. Not for safety. For relief. And Jacob noticed that. That night, Jacob could not sleep. His mother slept curled tightly, hands clasped near her face, breathing shallowly. Reb Mendel dozed while sitting upright, still as stone. Jacob sat awake, a blanket around his shoulders, listening to the building's breathing, pipes contracting with cold, wooden beams shifting, the faint hum of distant machinery. Then he heard it. Upstairs. A whisper. Not a conversation, whispers spoken to oneself. The Hauptmann's voice. At first Jacob could not hear the words, only the rhythm. He rose and moved silently to the spot beneath the floorboards where the sound carried best. That child, eyes, not natural. Pause. No, not fear, something else. Another voice, perhaps the same officer from the hallway earlier, responded, but too softly. Jacob leaned in, barely breathing. The way he looks, like he knows. Another pause. Animals look away. That boy does not. Silence. Then the phrase that would change everything. He should not be down there. Not he should not be alive, but he should not be down there. Meaning not forgotten. Not hidden. Not ignored. People fear what they cannot classify. The following day food did not come when expected. No knock from the landlord. No whispered warning. The candle burned lower than usual before Jacob's mother finally rose to check the small slit near the wall where sound from above traveled best. She froze midway. Boots. Right outside the cellar. Not walking. Waiting. Jacob stood. He felt no panic, only clarity, like snow when it first lands, silent and pure. The handle turned. This time it did not stop halfway. The door opened, slowly revealing the Hauptmann framed by shadows, eyes fixed directly on Jacob. His voice was steady but quiet, as though addressing something sacred or cursed. "We need to talk." The officers behind him shifted uncomfortably, none willing to step forward. Jacob did not move. He simply stared, calm, unblinking, unreadable. And something in the Hauptmann's composure cracked. Not visibly, but enough for every soul in the room to feel the air change. For the first time since they had hidden in the cellar, the door was left open behind the Hauptmann, as though closing it would admit fear. The officers stood in the hallway, not entering, not daring. Their eyes shifted nervously, not toward Jacob's mother nor toward Reb Mendel, but toward the small, silent boy who did nothing except exist in a way they could not categorize. The Hauptmann did not gesture for Jacob to come forward, nor did he step inside. He simply spoke, voice low, controlled. "Get him up." There were no weapons drawn. None were needed. Fear, when properly planted, was always more powerful than metal. Jacob's mother stepped instinctively between him and the soldiers. Her voice, though soft, trembled. "He is only a child." The Hauptmann did not blink. His expression was not cruel, only calculating, unsettled, determined to force clarity even if clarity did not exist. "Come," he repeated, eyes fixed solely on Jacob. The boy rose without shaking, without hesitation. His mother reached for his arm, but Jacob stepped out of reach, not with rebellion, but with the quiet inevitability of someone who understands that escape and refusal are sometimes the same thing. The hallway outside the cellar was colder than any winter wind, not because of temperature, but because of judgment waiting to hatch. Jacob was led, not dragged, into a room across the corridor. A former dining room, converted into an improvised command post, maps and papers scattered across a long wooden table still bearing scratches from a life before the war. The door closed behind them. Not slammed. Closed with intent. The Hauptmann took a seat while two officers remained standing on either side of the room, as though guarding something dangerous, though the only dangerous thing of note was the child staring back with unreadable calm. The Hauptmann folded his hands. "We have been informed," he began, voice slow and almost academic, "that you have been observing us." Jacob did not respond. The Hauptmann leaned forward slightly. "We are also told that when you look at people you make them uneasy." Silence. Unease multiplied in the space between breaths. The Hauptmann tapped a pen softly against the table, but the sound felt more like a countdown than impatience. "What exactly do you understand, boy?" Still no answer. One of the officers shifted uncomfortably, attempting to force a laugh that did not fully escape his throat. "Perhaps he is simple-minded," he muttered, though his eyes did not reflect certainty, only hope. The Hauptmann studied Jacob for another long moment, then spoke to the officer who had nearly stumbled in Jacob's presence days before. "What did you feel that day?" The officer stiffened. He wanted to refuse, but rank weighed heavier than pride. "It was like," he hesitated, embarrassed, "like he could see through me." Though the comparison was meant figuratively, everyone in the room felt it literally. The Hauptmann leaned back. How does a starving Jewish child make an armed officer feel discovered? No one answered because the question had no safe answer. Then the Hauptmann made a decision, not out of malice but out of fear disguised as logic. "Search the cellar," he ordered. Jacob's stomach tightened, not out of terror but of certainty. Fear was no longer theoretical. It had entered their world. The cellar door was thrown wide open as Jacob was escorted, still without force, back downstairs. His mother rushed toward him instantly, hands trembling, but the officers blocked her path. The Hauptmann raised a gloved hand, signaling silence. "No one will be harmed," he said, but the tone suggested that harm was not off the table, merely not currently required. Two soldiers began moving objects, tearing apart blankets, turning over crates, shifting coal sacks. Each sound felt like shovels of dirt being thrown into an already dug grave. The landlord appeared moments later, frantic, pale. "I did not hide anything." I told you. The Hauptmann silenced him with a stare. The search continued, but Jacob's attention was drawn to Reb Mendel, who did not move or flinch. The old man's eyes rested gently on Jacob, not with sadness or fear, but with recognition. He whispered so quietly only Jacob could hear, "They are not searching for evidence, they are searching for permission." The meaning took shape in Jacob's mind like ink bleeding into water. When a frightened man cannot explain something, he hunts not for proof, but for an excuse. Moments later, a soldier froze, arm deep inside a coal sack. Slowly he pulled out a small leather pouch, dust-covered, tied with fraying string. The Hauptmann turned sharply. "What is that?" The soldier opened it. Inside lay scraps of paper covered in Hebrew lettering, torn pages of a prayer book. Not a weapon. Not a map. Not a coded message. Yet the room stiffened. The Hauptmann stared at the pieces of sacred text as though looking at something radioactive. "What were you planning to do with this?" he demanded. Reb Mendel spoke before anyone else could. "They are prayers. Nothing more." But Jacob felt the truth land in the minds of the officers like a gavel. They had found something they did not understand. And therefore it was dangerous. The Hauptmann's voice lowered. "Why hide them?" Reb Mendel replied softly, "Because you would destroy them." The simplicity struck harder than accusation. Silence thickened. Then the Hauptmann looked at Jacob again, and everything clicked in his mind, not as truth, but as fear wearing the mask of clarity. "He has been listening," the Hauptmann murmured, "memorizing, learning, preparing." He took a step toward Jacob, speaking as though unveiling a conspiracy. "That is why you watch. Why you do not speak. Not fear, strategy." It was a theory born not of logic, but of terror needing shape. His mother cried out, "No. He is merely quiet." "No child studies soldiers unless he plans to use what he learns," the Hauptmann snapped. The accusation was born. Not because it was true, but because it felt true to a frightened mind. And once a frightened man feels something is true, it becomes true. Jacob was taken upstairs, not to be beaten, not to be killed, but to be made into an example. The officers forced him to stand in the hallway near the entrance, where every soldier lodging in the building would pass. A single chair was placed behind him, but no one permitted him to sit. His mother attempted to follow but was ordered to remain below. She fought, begged, pleaded, but Reb Mendel stopped her, hand gripping her wrist with surprising strength. "Do not bargain with men who fear," he whispered. "It makes them invent darker prices." Jacob stood, silent, while officers passed. He was not touched. He was not yelled at. He was not questioned. He was simply displayed. Like a warning. Like an omen. By midday, word had spread across the unit. The Jewish boy knows things. He remembers every detail. He stares into you like a doctor deciding where to cut. He listens through walls. He is collecting information. He is not normal. And worst of all, he is not afraid. Fear is a powerful weapon. But fear of someone who doesn't fear you is nuclear. By evening, soldiers avoided walking near him. They took longer routes around hallways, mumbled prayers, placed charms in boots, clutched crucifixes, refused to sleep near doors and whispered at night. He is not a boy. He is something else. And Jacob said nothing. Because there was nothing he could say that would be heard. A lie would be believed. The truth would be twisted. Silence was the only weapon left. As darkness fell, the Hauptmann made his final decision. Not publicly. Not proudly. But with the desperation of a man trapped inside his own reasoning. "He cannot stay here." His voice shook with certainty disguised as command. "We will transfer him at dawn." Transfer. A word that meant nothing specific and everything lethal. His mother fell to her knees in silent agony. Reb Mendel closed his eyes, whispering not a prayer but a conclusion. Jacob looked at the Hauptmann with the same calm stillness as the first moment they met. And that was when the Hauptmann understood the most terrifying thing of all. The boy wasn't trying to escape. He was waiting. Waiting for something the Hauptmann could not see. And that made it worse. Much worse. Night in the building did not fall, it seeped. It crawled down the staircase like a cold vapor, filling each corner and hollow, sliding beneath door frames, clinging to cloth and skin. The walls, already damp with winter, seemed to absorb the darkness as if storing it inside their memory, making the air thicker, slower, harder to swallow. Jacob stood at the far end of the hallway, still forbidden to sit, though now no one dared approach him. A weak light bulb above flickered, not rapidly but in long, shivering fades, like it was breathing unevenly. Its dim glow painted Jacob's pale face in thin strokes of yellow and shadow, making his eyes appear deeper than hollow, like dark wells carved into his skull. The floor beneath his bare feet was icy enough to burn, but he did not shift, did not lift a foot, did not clutch his arms around himself for warmth. His stillness was beginning to feel inhuman to the men watching him from a distance they pretended was casual. A line of boots lay under the soldiers' iron cots nearby, polished but quietly trembling, as though they were the ones afraid to be worn again. Through the wooden floor, calm rhythmic dripping echoed distantly from some unknown pipe or crack in the building's structure. Drip. Pause. Drip. Each drop sounded almost too perfectly spaced, like a metronome for dread, or like a message spelled in silence. From the open door of his temporary confinement, Jacob could see 3 soldiers gathered near the staircase, whispering. They leaned in close, whispering through clenched teeth rather than lips, as if sound itself had become a liability. Their eyes never stopped returning to him. Faces turned pale, breaths became uneven, and every accidental moment when one of them caught Jacob's gaze resulted in a visible shudder, a near-instant tightening of throat muscles, a swallow that was too hard, too loud. It wasn't Jacob's expression. He had none. It wasn't threat. He made none. It was the unshakable sensation that he was not merely looking at them, but looking inside them, and finding something. Hours passed, or minutes, or days, or seconds. Time was no longer a servant of clocks. Jacob's mother, still locked below, prayed into her hands, not for God to intervene, but for him to remember they existed. Reb Mendel, though outwardly calm, sat with his eyes open, staring into a corner of the basement as though he saw a shadow that didn't belong. Upstairs, the Hauptmann had moved to the end of the hallway, pacing again with measured, precise, nervous steps, the back of his leather gloves brushing his coat with each turn, producing a faint rustle that sounded like a warning whispered to itself. He would stop occasionally, tipping his head slightly as though listening not to Jacob, but to the silence around him, the silence he now believed belonged to the boy. At one point, while staring toward the window, the Hauptmann muttered under his breath, barely audible. "He is the quietest thing I have ever seen, and the loudest." His voice trembled like someone speaking in a church empty enough to be haunted by its own history. The paranoia did not stay contained. It spread. Not by accusation, not by orders, but by contagion. Fear always travels faster than logic. Late into the night, new soldiers returning from shift were briefed not with military protocol, but with a warning spoken in the tone usually reserved for cursed objects. Don't look the boy in the eyes. He hears through walls. He doesn't blink like a normal child. He's planning something. Jews pray before they strike. He is not afraid of us. Each sentence, whispered with conviction, fed the hallucination until it resembled truth. One man swore Jacob's shadow moved before he did. Another claimed Jacob was seen awake when no one else was. A third insisted the basement felt warmer when he wasn't in it. None of them questioned the impossibility of these claims. Fear had written new laws. Around 3 in the morning, the Hauptmann stood directly in front of Jacob again. The hallway smelled of damp wool, cold iron, and the faint acidic odor of adrenaline trapped under uniforms. His breath fogged slightly in the air, rising like smoke before dissolving into the ceiling shadows. The Hauptmann examined Jacob's face carefully, not like a child, not like a prisoner, but like an unclassified specimen. "You are not like the others," he whispered, voice fractured. Jacob remained completely still. He didn't even inhale visibly. The Hauptmann leaned closer, speaking like a man trying to convince himself he wasn't already insane. "I have seen brave men break. I have seen cowards pretend. I have seen saints betray. But you do nothing, and somehow you are the most threatening of them all." Jacob blinked once. Slow. Deliberate. Not defiant, diagnostic. The Hauptmann recoiled half a step, not because Jacob seemed dangerous, but because he suddenly understood he had lost control of what he didn't understand. At the basement door, Jacob's mother cried silently, no sound, no breath, her shoulders trembling like thin glass in wind. Reb Mendel kept his hand on her arm not to comfort, but to anchor. "We cannot scream," he whispered. "If we scream, they become certain." Back upstairs, one of the younger officers broke. He approached the Hauptmann, voice cracking, eyes red. "This child is unnatural, sir. He looked at me as if he knew I was thinking of deserting. I never said a word, but he knew." The Hauptmann stared at him, breathing hard. Then, like a general delivering a verdict that the night itself demanded, he whispered, "At sunrise, he will be taken away." Those words did not echo. They absorbed. Even the walls understood. Jacob remained unmoving, but inside, something shifted. A realization, not emotional but observational. Fear had become its own fuel. He didn't need to run. He didn't need to fight. He didn't need to speak. They would destroy themselves if he simply remained. Survival had changed shape. Survival had become stillness sharpened to a blade. And in that moment, Jacob understood something terrible and true. The most dangerous thing in a world built on fear is not the monster in the shadows. It is the quiet child they cannot predict. The candle upstairs flickered one last time, and blew out without wind. Darkness swallowed everything. Their minds finished the job. The boy who walked out of the war. Dawn did not arrive with light. It arrived with a thinning of darkness, a slow gray leaking that made the outlines of objects appear before the color returned to them. The hallway where Jacob stood felt like the inside of a throat that had forgotten how to speak. Cold seeped up through the wooden floor. The bulb above him hummed faintly, then went silent, its filament glowing the dull orange of dying embers. Somewhere far away beyond the broken roofs and smokestacks of Berlin, a siren tested its own voice, a wavering line of sound that rose, faltered, and fell again. It was not yet the full scream of an air raid, but a clearing of the throat of fate. Jacob's bare toes had gone numb a long time ago. The skin on his heels felt like cracked porcelain. Yet he did not shift his weight or tuck his feet beneath him for warmth. His stillness had become a second skin. Time stretched. The building breathed, wooden beams contracting, whispering faint clicks, distant pipes rattling with unseen water, someone snoring behind a closed door, a match scratching to life in another room, releasing a faint sulfur ghost into the air. At the far end of the corridor, the Hauptmann emerged from his office. His eyes were ringed with sleepless purple. His uniform, though properly buttoned, held the stiffness of a man who had changed clothes by habit, not intention. His hair was combed, but his hand had gone through it too many times in the night, leaving uneven ridges. He walked toward Jacob slowly, heels tapping a hollow rhythm on the wooden boards. Tap, tap, tap. He stopped a few paces away. For a moment he said nothing. His breath clouded slightly in the cold air between them, then disappeared. "You know what will happen at sunrise?" he said finally, voice hoarse. Jacob didn't respond. The Hauptmann studied his face, searching for something: fear, pleading, anger, any sign that they were still bound by the same rules of cause and effect. There was nothing. Only those dark, steady eyes, absorbing and returning the world with a strange neutrality. "I am following orders," the Hauptmann continued. "Do you understand that?" Jacob blinked once. The Hauptmann's jaw tightened. "I did not make this war," he said. "I did not build this machine. I am inside it, like everyone else. You think I am free?" His voice cracked on the last word, a crack he smoothed over with force. Jacob listened. He heard the words. But he also heard what lay underneath them, the restless tremor of a man who needed the world to be explainable, even as it slipped through his fingers like smoke. "I do not fear you," the Hauptmann whispered. They both knew it was a lie. A door opened down the hall. Two officers stepped out, adjusting belts, strapping on holsters, their movements jerky from lack of sleep and an excess of thoughts. They glanced toward Jacob and quickly looked away, as if catching sight of a grave they had not ordered to be dug. The Hauptmann turned away abruptly. "At sunrise," he repeated, more to himself than to anyone else. "We will be done with this." He walked back toward his office, his shoulders squared as if marching toward a verdict only he could hear. Jacob watched him go. He noticed the way the man's right shoulder dipped half a centimeter lower than the left when tired. He noticed how the Hauptmann's gloved hand brushed the same spot on the wall every time he passed, fingers grazing the faint, raised line where the wallpaper had peeled. He noticed the way his boots hit the floor. One board near the office door gave a softer creak than the others. All of it was just information. And Jacob collected information. It was the only thing the war hadn't taken from him. He had not slept in the hallway. At some point during the night, when the soldiers' whispers had thinned and their footsteps had grown slower, heavier, Jacob had moved. Quietly. Methodically. He had waited until he could distinguish the deep, even breathing of men truly asleep from the shallow, restless panting of those pretending. Then he listened for the building itself, for the creaks that came from age rather than recent pressure, for the sighs of brick and plaster, the minute pops of cooling metal. When he was sure no one near him was awake, he took 3 slow breaths, feeling the cold air burn through his nose, into his chest and out again. Then he stepped forward. Not many steps. Just enough. He moved the way water finds a path through rock, not by force but by knowing where the gaps are. He stepped only where he knew the boards did not squeak. He had mapped them in his mind during the hours of being forced to stand. He had memorized which planks groaned under weight and which held their silence. He slid along the wall, fingertips brushing it lightly, tracking cracks in the plaster, feeling the faint chill leaking from the staircase down to the cellar, marking in his head the precise place where the wall no longer felt like wall. At the bottom of the stairs, on one of the nights before, he'd noticed it. A change in the texture of the stone, a lower echo when he tapped it with his knuckles while pretending to trip. There was space behind that part of the wall. A gap. An old coal chute, perhaps. Or a sealed passage between buildings. Berlin was full of such hidden arteries, routes for heat and goods and secrets. He had stored that knowledge away. Now, in the darkest hour before dawn, he confirmed it. The hollow sound, the faint draft, the smell of old dust rather than fresh damp. The building had a way out. It simply did not know it yet. When the Hauptmann found the scrap of Hebrew text hours later, just as the weak, early light began to seep through the small office window, something inside him lurched. He had not placed this here. No one should have been in his office. He stared at the letters, curves and lines he could not read, shapes that looked like hooks thrown into some unseen sky. His heartbeat stuttered. He looked up slowly, eyes falling on the slightly shifted map. The railway line now cut through the rectangle marked with his unit's number, as though pointing. His gaze slid to the photograph of the woman on his desk. Its angle changed, no longer resting in quiet loyalty but watching the doorway. Watching his back. The rational part of his mind tried to speak. Someone snuck in. A boy. A Jew. He is playing tricks. But another part, the one marinated in weeks of whispers, in war, in rumors of partisans and sabotage and curses, spoke louder. You are being watched. Not just by him. By something behind him. As if on cue, as if the city itself had listened to the rise of his fear and decided to add its own note, the sirens began to howl. This time it was not a test. The sound tore through the gray morning, sharp and rising, drilling into walls and bones and thoughts. The Hauptmann jolted to his feet, the scrap of Hebrew still pinched between thumb and forefinger. His chair scraped loudly against the floor, tipping sideways. Outside in the corridor, doors flew open. Officers stumbled out, half-dressed, boots half-laced, faces pale in the sickly bulb light. Luftangriff, someone shouted. Air raid. The word rolled through the building like a wave, crashing into each room. The Allied bombers were coming. Again. In normal circumstances, protocol was clear. Shelter. Basement. Protect the men. Protect the radios. Protect the chain of command. But these were not normal circumstances. They had a boy in their building. A boy who moved without sound. A boy whose gaze scraped nerves raw. A boy who somehow placed pieces of Jewish prayer under a Hauptmann's hand without opening a door. A boy who stood all night without trembling, as if drawing strength not from food, but from the very fear he created. The Hauptmann stepped out into the hall, fingers tightening around the prayer scrap until it crinkled. The soldiers turned to him at once. Fear makes people snap to command faster than discipline. Basement, sir? One asked, gripping the stair rail. They all knew the basement was the safest place. Thick walls. Oh, no windows. They had hidden there during raids before. The Hauptmann's eyes flicked down toward the cellar door. They stared at it. At what lay behind it. Not just the boy. The prayers. The whispers. The Jewish God they believed had not yet managed to save his people, and that terrified them more than if he had. Because what if he was saving some, in ways they did not see? For a second, the Hauptmann's face twisted with internal war. If they went down there, they would be trapped with him. With the boy. With whatever followed him. If they stayed up here, the bombs might find them. Fear weighed itself on either side of the scale. Then, with a voice strained enough to sound almost like someone else's, the Hauptmann hissed. Not the basement. The soldiers stared at him. But sir. Not the basement, he roared this time, a raw, ripped shout. Silence slammed into the hallway. The sirens wailed louder outside, their sound a rising, metallic scream. We go to the other building, the Hauptmann snapped, chest heaving. They have a proper shelter. Oh. Now. But the boy, one officer began. Stays, the Hauptmann said. The word fell heavy. Stays. In the cellar. Alone. Exposed. Left to whatever the sky had in store. None of the soldiers argued. None of them wanted to descend those stairs. They moved like a single, panicked animal toward the entrance, hands grabbing helmets, belts, papers. A few snatched up personal items, crosses, letters, photographs. No one reached for Jakob. They parted around him like water around a stone, avoiding brushing against him, eyes skittering away from his. Within moments, the hallway was almost empty. Only the Hauptmann remained. He stood several meters away, breathing heavily, the sirens outside pressing against the windows like sound trying to shatter glass. He looked at Jakob one last time. There was no triumph in his gaze. No cruelty. Only terror sharpened into superstition. "You brought this," he whispered, the scrap of Hebrew crumpled in his fist. "You and your God. Let him protect you now." Jakob held his eyes. The Hauptmann flinched. Then he turned and fled, boots pounding down the stairs, the echoes of his steps swallowed by the sirens. The front door slammed. Jakob was alone. The building exhaled. The sirens outside climbed higher, overlapping with each other until they formed one extended shriek. Somewhere in the distance, anti-aircraft batteries began to bark, dull, rhythmic thuds that made the glass in the window panes tremble. Jakob moved. Not quickly. Not frantically. He simply unfroze. His legs tingled painfully as blood returned to them. He ignored it, making his way to the cellar door with the calm, efficient steps of someone following a plan he had already rehearsed in his mind. He slipped inside, closing it softly behind him. The cellar was darker than before. The candle had burned nearly all the way down, its flame a sputtering puddle of light. His mother rushed to him at once, grabbing his face in both hands, her fingers icy and rough. "Jakob," her voice cracked. "What did they? Are you hurt?" He shook his head once. Her breath shuddered out. Tears spilled over, leaving clean tracks through soot on her cheeks. Reb Mendel watched them quietly from his corner, eyes glittering in the candlelight. "They left," Jakob said. It was the first word he had spoken in hours. His mother blinked. "What?" "They left the building," he repeated. Above them, the sky began to roar. The distant hum of engines swelled into a low, continuous growl that set the pipes shaking, dust drifting down from nearly invisible cracks in the ceiling. The ground trembled faintly under their feet, like a giant taking slow steps. "Air raid," his mother whispered, voice tight with dread. "They always come here. They always come." She clutched him to her chest, as if her arms alone could hold the roof in place. Jakob gently pulled free. "We can't stay here," he said. Mendel tilted his head. "And go where, boy? Up where the sky is spitting fire. Or out where uniforms chase ghosts for sport." Jakob walked to the bottom of the stairs. He pressed his palm against the section of wall where the stone felt wrong, smoother, cooler, with the faintest hint of a gap. "This building has a throat," he murmured. "A way out." His mother stared at him. "Jakob, we have no time for games." "It's not a game." He balled his fist and knocked gently. The wall answered with a hollow sound. Mendel's eyes narrowed. "Coal chute," he said softly. "In old houses they delivered fuel that way. But it was sealed." "Sealed for people," Jakob said. "Not for air." Another rumble shook plaster from the ceiling. Loose chunks of concrete dropped in the far corner, shattering on the floor. Somewhere above, glass exploded outward in a shrill cascade. The first bombs had begun to fall. There was no time left to argue. Jakob jammed his fingers into a narrow crack between stones, feeling how they had been cemented long ago but not perfectly. War and time had done their work. Mortar crumbled under pressure. He dug. Not with desperation. With focus. His nails split and bled, dirt grinding into small wounds. He gritted his teeth, not from pain, but from the effort of forcing the old construction to remember it had once been open. He felt hands join his. Mendel's surprisingly strong. Then his mother's, trembling but determined. Together they pulled. Stone shifted with a grinding groan that sounded disturbingly like an animal waking from a too long sleep. Dust burst into the air, thick and choking. The candle flame flailed and died, plunging them into darkness. But behind the stone, cold air rushed in, damp, fresh, smelling of mold and old soot. "Jakob," his mother whispered, coughing. "Can we fit?" He turned his face toward the gap. It was narrow but not impossibly so. Beyond it he could feel space, a vertical shaft, wood-lined in parts, metal-rimmed in others. A chute. A way up. Or out. Or buried. They had no more choices left. He wiped dust from his eyes with the back of his wrist. "I'll go first," he said. His mother's fingers dug into his sleeve. "If it collapses, then only I am trapped," he said quietly. "Not you." Her breath broke in a sound that was almost a sob, almost a laugh. "Since when did you become the one who decides who is trapped?" she whispered. He didn't answer. He turned sideways and slid into the opening, stone scraping his shoulders through the thin fabric of his stolen coat. The cold bit into his ribs. His fingers found small ridges, old nails, bits of wood where coal had once scraped and torn. He climbed. Above him, the hollow shaft funneled the sounds of the raid, the distant whistling of falling bombs, the thunder of impact, the eerie rolling echoes of explosions bouncing between streets and walls and empty courtyards. Somewhere, a building screamed as it collapsed. The chute flexed around him, dust sifting down, coating his hair, his lashes, his tongue. At one point the shaft narrowed. Wood pressed into his chest and spine at once. For a moment he could not breathe. He closed his eyes. He listened. Not to the bombs. To the building. To the way it groaned and shook but held. There was space ahead. He pushed. Forcing his thin body forward, scraping skin, ripping cloth, not stopping until the pressure eased and the air grew slightly less stagnant. He felt a grate above him, rusted, embedded in the outer wall. Light seeped through slits in weak stripes, dust motes dancing in them like exhausted ghosts. He shoved with both hands. The metal protested, squealed, then gave way with a jerking clatter, falling outward into whatever lay beyond. Cold air flooded in. Real air. Open air. He pulled himself up, elbows hooking over the ledge, and dragged his small body out of the chute. He emerged into a narrow alley between buildings, half choked with rubble. Gray light pressed between them, heavy with smoke. The sky above was a chaos of dark clouds and distant flashes. Thin lines of anti-aircraft fire scratched at it in vain. The building he had just left loomed to his right, its upper floors scarred by previous raids, its windows gaping, its walls trembling with each new explosion. The front door stood open, swinging slightly on broken hinges. No soldiers. No boots. No voices. Just abandonment. Jakob rolled onto the ground, chest heaving, dust and blood painting his hands. Then he turned and reached down into the chute. "Your turn," he said, voice rough. His mother's fingers appeared first, then her wrist, then her forearm, all covered in stone dust. He grabbed her and pulled, bracing his feet against the wall, hauling her up with all the strength his thin arms could gather. She emerged with a cry, half pain, half astonishment, collapsing into the alley beside him. Moments later, Reb Mendel's hands groped at the opening. Jakob and his mother worked together, pulling, grunting, ignoring the protests of their own bodies. The old man's coat snagged for a terrifying second on a protruding nail, but he twisted, freed it, and finally collapsed onto the broken cobblestones, coughing explosively. For a few heartbeats they lay there, the three of them, gasping, covered in dust, listening to the war raging above them. Then Jakob rose to his knees. "We can't stay here," he said again. This time no one argued. They moved along the alley, keeping close to the walls as debris fell in distant streets. The air tasted of burning brick and coal, metal and something else. Something that made Jacob's stomach twist if he thought about it too much. They passed a doorway blown open, revealing a staircase that led nowhere. A bicycle lay twisted on the ground, its wheel spinning slowly, ticking like a clock that had forgotten what time it was. Each explosion lit the sky for an instant, stark white, before plunging everything back into gray. They reached the end of the alley and peeked around the corner. The street was almost empty. No patrols. No officers. No hauptmen. Only a handful of civilians, hunched and running, clutching bundles, ducking into whatever shelter they could find. The unit that had occupied their building had fled to another bunker, convinced that the basement was cursed. Convinced that the boy they feared was better left to the bombs. They had not left a single guard. They did not want to watch what happened to him. Jakob stepped out onto the street. His mother gripped his shoulder. "Where do we go?" He scanned the street. He saw the collapsed facade of a bakery, smoke rising from its ruins. A tram frozen mid-track, its windows shattered. The outlines of the city he had known as a child, distorted but still there. Tram lines, corners, roof angles. He remembered the way to the river. To older neighborhoods with cellars that had become unofficial shelters. To places where uniforms went less often. "We walk," he said. "With them." He nodded toward the civilians. "We become part of what they don't care about." Mendel managed a dry, humorless chuckle. "An excellent strategy," he rasped. "To survive by being unimportant." They moved. No one paid them particular attention. There were too many reasons to keep one's eyes on the sky. They passed a wall where posters peeled in the heat and damp, loud colors shouting about victory and duty, edges curling as if the wall itself were tired of holding them. Jakob felt eyes on him once, a woman clutching a child of her own. She looked at him, at his thin face, at the dust and drying blood on his hands. Her gaze flinched when their eyes met. Not in fear. In recognition. Then she looked away, tightening her grip on her child, quickening her pace. The war swallowed them all. No one ever found a record of the transfer order for the boy from the building on the east side of Berlin. The Hauptmann later insisted, when asked by another officer weeks afterward, that the child had died in the bombing of that sector, that the basement had taken a direct hit, that no human could have survived. He said it with such conviction that even he almost believed it. Almost. But sometimes, late at night, in another makeshift office in another shattered building, he would wake in the dark with the distinct sensation that someone was standing by the door. Silent. Watching. Measuring. He would turn on the lamp with a shaking hand, breath coming fast, and find nothing there. Nothing but a faint, persistent draft. And once he found a tiny fragment of burned paper on his desk, curled and blackened, with a single Hebrew letter still visible in the center, untouched by flame. He told no one. After the war, stories began to circulate among those who had survived the Berlin raids. Stories of a Jewish boy who had once stood in the hallway of a Wehrmacht lodging, unarmed, underfed, unspeaking, and yet had terrified hardened Nazi officers so deeply that they abandoned their own shelter rather than share a basement with him. Some said he escaped the city entirely and was seen years later in another country, sitting very still in the back of a synagogue, eyes closed, lips unmoving, listening to prayers as if they were coordinates. Others swore he stayed in Berlin, moving among ruins like a shadow, leading small groups of families to cellars that never seemed to collapse, arriving always minutes before the bombs and disappearing just as the dust settled. Most dismissed the tales as wartime inventions. But every now and then, when the story was told softly in crowded rooms, candles flickering low, someone who had worn a uniform in those years would shift uncomfortably, staring at their hands. They would remember a hallway. A boy. Eyes that did not look at them but through them. And none of them could ever quite answer the question that lingered at the end of that memory. If he was only a child, why had they been so afraid? No one knew where Jakob Stein went after that morning in Berlin, 1944. No file carried his name. No grave bore his mark. But some of the old people, the ones who still listened more than they spoke, claimed that when the sirens tested their voices in later years, in other countries, other conflicts, there was sometimes just beneath the wail the faint echo of a child's footsteps on wooden boards. And they would whisper that, somewhere between the sound and the silence, the boy who terrified Nazi officers was still walking quietly through the cracks of history, watching those who believed themselves untouchable and teaching them, without ever speaking, how deeply a single gaze can make the mighty tremble.